Good Tuesday morning. Cedarfield has the pleasure of presenting another focus group presentation. Part of it entails Virginia Tech. Some of our residents were graduates of VPI. Some of us had children graduate from Virginia Tech. Now, some of us have grandchildren at Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech is a prestigious university recognized in our Commonwealth and throughout this country. However, on April 16th, 2007, a mass shooting occurred and absolutely destroyed the tranquility of that campus in Blacksburg. Our guest speaker today, Lori Haas, had a daughter, Emily, who was shot twice and has survived. The impact of that shooting and that healing process has gone on for a decade and more. We have invited Lori to share her own personal experience and her activism in lobbying for legislation and educating the public through grassroots efforts. Let us welcome Lori Haas.
Thank you. I need y'all to let me know if you can hear me clearly and if I'm talking too loud or not talking loud enough. So just raise your hand if our sound is good. Everybody, does that work for everybody? Okay, good. Good morning. As Barbara mentioned, my name is Lori Haas. I'm a resident of Richmond, Virginia. I have 3 beautiful children and 2 grandchildren. And I'm happy if you call me Nana. As Barbara mentioned, I am work on gun violence prevention. And let me preface this at the start. It's about saving lives. I'll repeat that. It's about saving lives. 13 plus years ago, I was with my minister out shopping for fabric. My middle child, Wyatt, was about to be confirmed, and we were going to make these confirmation stoles. My phone kept ringing, and I was with my minister. I was being polite. I was not going to answer my cell phone, for goodness sake. But then I happened to notice that the area code was 540. And I thought, that's odd. You know, that's Southwest Virginia. Well, that's odd. That's where Emily is, a sophomore in Virginia Tech. Intuition, you know, divine intervention, I don't know. I looked at my minister and said, I have to answer this call. And my daughter was on the other line, and she said, hi, Mommy, I've been shot. And so, sent our family on a journey that just could not be described and never anticipated, and no description. You know, there's no guidebook for a parent whose daughter's been shot and injured in a mass shooting of that size, of that impact, of that horrific nature. My husband and I jumped in the car with help from friends and family who descended on the house, and somebody was dispatched to get my middle son, who's a freshman in high school. Somebody was dispatched to the elementary school to keep an eye on my younger son. We didn't want him to hear from strangers. And you know, if y'all remember the panic of that day, my husband and I drove probably over 90 miles an hour to Southwest Virginia to get to the hospital. And I can remember that drive like it was yesterday. Vehicle after vehicle after vehicle passing us. Emergency personnel, first responders, FBI, feds, local police, sheriffs, you name it, everybody was headed in that direction. And they were passing us. We were going 90 some miles an hour. I was frightened to death for everybody. And then I remember most is the radio, listening to the radio to try to get information. And the body count going up. 6 dead, 10 dead, 14 dead, 19 dead. And just sobbing the whole way, thinking and praying with gratitude that my husband and I were going to get our daughter, who was alive and who was going to make it and who was being cared for. And then how many other parents were making that same drive to pick up dead children. We live in one of the greatest countries in the world. It shouldn't be this way. It just shouldn't be this way. I will share that Emily survived her injuries. They were minor, if you can call gunshots minor. She was very, very brave that morning. Her classmate Colin had called 911 when the teacher said, slam the door, blockade the door, get under your desks, move over here, there's a shooter. Colin had his phone on him. Emily did not. Her book bag was across the room because she was in French class and they were doing a conversation exercise. So almost all of the students were not near their regular desks or their belongings. And Colin had called 911. Unfortunately, about that time, the shooter burst into the room. He was one of the first injured. He dropped his phone and it went sliding across the floor. Emily picked it up. About the time she picked it up, the emergency dispatcher was on the other line and said, "Where are you? What is going on?" Emily was able to share what classroom they were in, what building they were in, some details about the shooter. She hid the phone under her hair, crouched down from the shooter, and kept the phone line open during the entire ordeal. So law enforcement had access to some information that they might not have had via my daughter, who was remarkably, remarkably brave. Even getting shot, she kept the phone line open and kept the dispatcher on the line. Later, my dad had somebody who's high up in security, international, Homeland Security, some big wig, say that he trains his operatives for hundreds and hundreds of hours to do what Emily did by instinct, and that she was one of the bravest people he'd ever had the pleasure of meeting and knowing. I share that because we know our youth are resilient, and Emily's recovered. It was a long, long journey. PTSD is very, very difficult. I don't know if any of you have served your country and understand what post-traumatic stress disorder is, but she was basically, under fire, for many, many minutes. In her classroom alone, there were more deaths than in any other classroom. 11 students plus the teacher were killed. 7 survived. Emily was one of them. And, we're grateful that she's alive. She and all of the injured students, which some people don't know, went back to Virginia Tech. Emily went back to the scene of her murder. And it was difficult, but she successfully negotiated with some help and some treatment and therapy and friends and a survivors group on campus that met regularly. She got her degree. She's married. She's a high school French teacher in Madison County, Virginia, and has two beautiful children who are just a delight. But that's our personal story. Some of it, there were setbacks along the way, and there were difficulties along the way. But one of the things that some families went through was, what happened? Why did it happen? How did it happen? What were the circumstances that allowed this person to have access to a firearm? What's being done? What wasn't being done that this person had access to a firearm? And we learned a lot. I learned a lot. I learned that we didn't have background checks on all gun sales, that not all the prohibiting records are in the system. We have a wonderful, robust, thoroughly managed background check system run by the Virginia State Police. The Virginia State Police started a background check system in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1989. When the Brady Bill passed in '94, establishing background checks by federal firearms licensed dealers, the feds and the FBI came to Virginia and said, how do we do this? How do we set this up? So in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have one of the best drug background check systems. Unfortunately, we don't apply it to all purchasers. And that's one of the problems. We also learned that there are some prohibitions on certain people. If you've been adjudicated mentally ill in front of it could be a judge, it could be a magistrate, it could be a special justice. If you're adjudicated seriously and dangerously mentally ill, you're prohibited from purchasing and owning firearms. One of the criteria of that adjudication used to be assumed that the patient would have to be ordered into inpatient treatment. And as some of you might know, in the mental health services field, there has been a trend over many years, and rightfully so, for treatment to occur outside of a residential facility. So the shooter in the Virginia Tech tragedy, despite the fact that he had been adjudicated and ordered into treatment, it wasn't a residential facility. He was ordered into outpatient treatment. So he was able to purchase a firearm despite what some legal experts at the time said, oh no, he should have been prohibited. That regulation was changed by executive order by then Governor Tim Kaine very shortly after the shooting. But many other things didn't change after the Virginia Tech tragedy. Many of the families began to work and speak up and speak out and say, if this can happen in Virginia, it can happen anywhere. And we need more regulations. If we can identify who is dangerous and who is at risk of committing violence by their behavior, by the data, by the research, why are we allowing them to have access to firearms? And perhaps the prohibitions need to be studied. Perhaps the prohibitions need to be understood, where they're working and where they're not working. I began to volunteer with a number of the gun violence prevention organizations that exist. We use the acronym GVP, Gun Violence Prevention. As I opened my remarks, it's about preventing gun violence. It's about saving lives. And in 2009, I was loud, I was active, I was busy. I took it on as a personal cause and a personal commitment. I said to myself at the time when I was getting involved, I have seen too much pain. And perhaps some of you may have buried a child for whatever reason. But I saw too much pain. Parents like myself who were burying a dead child for no other reason than someone had access to a firearm. They're preventable. Think about it. Preventable. We do everything we can when there's been a plane crash, from months and months and months and months of study to what were the circumstances, where are the interventions, what are the fixes. There's so many deadly diseases out there, and we have hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars studying them so we can prevent them. We're not doing the same for the public health epidemic of gun violence. Gun violence, by some studies, there was a Newsweek article recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Very well regarded, very well respected public health journal. Firearm deaths are the second leading cause of death for children between the ages of 1 and 19 in America. That's a travesty in a country that is as capable and as smart and as developed. And as I would like to think kind and caring that we could be and should be, we should be doing more. We know that gun deaths have increased over these years. We're up to almost 40,000 gun deaths annually in this country. Gun deaths in Virginia outpace motor vehicle deaths. And we know that some of these regulations and actions can work. States with strong gun laws have the lowest rates of gun deaths. Probably wouldn't surprise you to learn that Massachusetts has a gun death rate, these are per 100,000, of 3.5. Virginia's 11.8 gun deaths. And states with virtually no regulations rank the highest. Alabama, 22.9. Arkansas, 20.3. Alaska, 21.8. Mississippi, 22.9. Missouri, 21.5. New Mexico, 40.7. New York, 4.1. Hawaii, 4. And the list goes on and on. And again, Virginia is in the middle. And I'd like us to do better. I'd like us to address gun violence in all its forms. Gun homicides, gun suicides, and other. Other could be justifiable homicides, perhaps by law enforcement, or accidents, a toddler, shooting another toddler. But my organization wants to address, again, gun violence in all its forms. I'll go back. I'll take you back to 2009. I started working on this issue in a volunteer capacity. Not long after, I was hired by the Educational Fund to Stop Gun Violence. They're a C3 public health organization that researches gun violence, again, in all its forms. It uses the data and the research to point us in the right direction. We have a C4, which is the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, where we do a lot of advocacy and messaging and lobbying. We have networks all over the Commonwealth. We have networks at the federal level. We've worked, frankly, with previous administrations. We've worked with this White House. We've worked with this Congress. We've worked with this legislature. I'm specifically responsible for Virginia. I'm the state director for the Commonwealth in Virginia, and have worked on legislation at the state level since 2009. It's been hard work. You know, while many constituents and many voters and many faith organizations and many public health persons, medical personnel, groups all across the Commonwealth said we need stronger laws, we need stronger laws, we need stronger laws. It wasn't until 2020, this last session, that we were able to actually get some laws passed in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Think about that. Not to pat myself on the back, but I've been testifying and working at the Virginia General Assembly, every Virginia General Assembly session since 2008. My 13th time. I felt like it was Groundhog Day some years. I was going back saying the same thing. But after 13 long years, we had a General Assembly that was voted in 2019 that was committed to preventing gun violence and passing the laws that we had advocated for so long. We passed background checks in Virginia. We passed a child access prevention law. We passed a risk order law. We passed a requirement to report lost and stolen guns. Think about it, cops could do a trace. Do you need me?
Yeah, the live stream.
Okay. Sorry. There you go. Okay. A bill to report lost and stolen firearms. Think about it. Cops go to a crime scene, trace a firearm. to the last known owner, and the owner says, oops, I lost it. Oops, it was stolen. That person has got to be a trafficker. They buy 5 or 6 firearms, they sell them on the streets, and then when it's traced back to them, they just claim ignorance. Not anymore in Virginia. We're requiring that any firearm owner report it lost and stolen within, it's either 48 or 72 hours. Domestic violence. A history of violence is the single biggest predictor of future violence. And we have worked long and hard to make persons subject to permanent protective orders. During the time of that protective order, that person cannot own, purchase, or transport firearms. That's a very, very important law. It will save lives. We passed a bill that allowed localities to put in regulations about where and when and how firearms can be carried in their localities. Think of Charlottesville and the Unite the Right rally, where we had guns on every corner, every block, every street, everywhere. And the law enforcement, frankly, didn't know who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. Then Governor McAuliffe, riding into town with the Secretary of Public Safety and the police chief and something, commented to his passengers sitting in the car with him and said, oh look, they're the good guys. And the police chief had to tap him on the shoulder and say, Governor, they're not ours. They're dressed up to look like ours. So we passed a law that allows localities to regulate firearms at permitted events, city council meetings, government functions, other places. They passed a law prohibiting purchases of handguns to 1 per month. We know that handguns are used in much of our crime in the Commonwealth and across the country. And we know that persons who purchase tens and tens and tens and dozens of handguns are in fact trafficking them on our streets, causing too much gun violence. We passed laws that prohibit firearms in daycares and in preschools. Think about that. It was not on the books in the Commonwealth of Virginia. We passed a law that requires in-person training if you want to apply for and get a concealed handgun permit. And we passed some others who are relating to militias and trainings of school resource officers and some other bills. It will take a while for the data to come through. These laws will have to be on the books for years. I suspect that in the next year or the next year we'll hear the other side say, see, you passed all these gun laws and the gun deaths and the gun shootings haven't come down. But we know that they will. We know that states that have strong gun laws have fewer gun deaths. What we also did in the Commonwealth of Virginia over the last several years is get monies put in the budget to fund community-based violence interruption program. We know that, frankly, systemic racism has led to conditions in too many communities that beget violence. Lack of resources, housing, school, education, jobs, healthcare. The disparities are great, and it puts too many communities at greater risk of being victims of gun violence. Not because of the color of their skin, but because of the conditions of their communities through no fault of their own. And we think that interventions have been shown to reduce gun violence. And we'd like to fund those community-based interventions. And we have, with the governor's help. One of the bills that did not pass in the 2020 session, which frankly talking to the administration about shortly, is semi-automatic assault style rifles are still not banned in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I think that we will work on those again this year and next year and the next years, and we're not going away. I've been at it for 13 years and I have no intention of leaving my job or leaving this issue. You know, we again care about gun violence in all its forms. And I want to talk about one of the bills we passed this year, which is called a risk order. Is anybody familiar with what's called extreme risk protection orders? In middle of December 2012, a shooting took place in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. 26 children, I call them babies, they were 5, 6, 7 years old, and 6 educators were gunned down. In 2013, my organization put the researchers in a room much like this, from all over the country, public health officials, academics, professors, law enforcement, responders, first responders, and said, and I'm taking a line from the gun lobby, if guns don't kill people and people kill people, who are those people? How do we identify them, and how do we prohibit those people from access to firearms? And what we learned was, through study and research by these academics who spent months, this wasn't a 1 week long project, it's years. They're still in existence, they're still providing the data and the research. Persons with a diagnosed mental illness do not cause gun violence in this country. They are not the reason for gun violence in this country. Access to firearms is the reasons. Only 3 to 5% of persons with a diagnosed mental illness will ever commit interpersonal violence. They may be at heightened risk for intrapersonal, i.e. self-harm, but they're in the same risk pool as you and I for committing gun violence. So we could provide all the resources, all the treatment options, all the doctors, all the programs for persons with mental illness. And trust me, they deserve all the care they need, just like anybody else with a physical diagnosis or a medical problem. But that's not going to solve the gun violence problem in this country. Think about all the mass shootings. Don't you think to yourself, how did that person slip through the cracks? How did they have access to a firearm? It's because there are behaviors that put that person at heightened risk of committing violence, but those behaviors aren't gun prohibitory. Angry white men of a certain age, younger, are a risk category for committing mass shootings. Think about them, all the mass shootings in this country. Some huge percentage of them, 90-some%, are committed by young, white, angry white men. That's a risk category. Hate is a risk category. Certain crises in your life that may be temporary, a death, a divorce, loss of job, put you in a risk category based on the crisis that you're dealing with. None of those are mental illness. So I plead with you when you hear about or have people talk to you in your circles, oh, well, that's mental illness, that's mental illness. Please correct them. We're stigmatizing and lumping an entire category of people erroneously. This group of academics and researchers said, we need a method to disarm people during that period of crisis, not permanently, but during that period of crisis. We do it with protective orders for victims of domestic violence. Most protective orders are 1 or 2 years long, and during that time, that victim the perpetrator can get the help he or she needs, and the victim can get the services and a safety plan and separation from the abuser, or whatever that security plan looks like. Those are called protective orders. They're domestic violence protective orders. Some states call them restraining orders. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, we call them protective orders. So this academic group said, we need protective orders and risk orders for people at risk of committing gun violence, so we can temporarily separate them from his or her firearms. That law passed in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 2020. It became law on July 1st. And in the first 60 days, 36 extreme risk protective orders were issued in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Those are only allowed after a judicial process. A law enforcement officer or a Commonwealth's attorney goes in front of a judge and says, based on the preponderance of the evidence, this person is at risk of self-harm or harm to others, and we want to temporarily have him or her relinquish their firearm. These risk orders are 180 days, 6 months. They can be extended based on certain circumstances and appearances in front of the judge and added evidence. But think about it. You have a person, and state police have told me this anecdotally all the time. They call a loved one calls the cops and said, Uncle Johnny's in the backyard. He's got a 12-pack of beer. He's got his 2 firearms at his feet. He's despondent. He's, threatening self-harm, and he's this and he's that. Can you come get his gun? Most circumstances, law enforcement has to say no. He's not broken the law and he's not prohibited. A person has to be in a dire mental health crisis. And then the person is taken into custody. It's called an ECO, Emergency Custody Order. Imagine that, all these years that I testified and advocated and pleaded to get a risk order that would temporarily take your firearm away through a judicial process. And many people fought that. That's not legal, that's not constitutional. They can't take your firearm away. But we have an emergency custody order. We can take your entire body away into custody with no crime committed. Didn't make sense to us. So we have these risk orders. They're now available. We share with families. If you have a concern, call your local law enforcement officer, call your local Commonwealth's attorney, and let's temporarily disarm your loved one who may be at risk. California or Florida, and I'm sorry I don't have the numbers right in front of me, I think it was California, have intervened in over 20 situations where a person had indicated publicly and with family or friends or social media and other spaces and places that they wanted to commit a mass shooting. Many of these risk orders are to separate a person who's in crisis from self-harm. We know that a person who died by suicide, the most lethal form of suicide is a firearm. A person attempting a suicide with a firearm is successful in some studies over 90% of the time. All other suicide attempts combined are only successful 5 to 10% of the time. Most suicides are impulsive. In a moment of dire pain, a person says, I've got to stop the pain. And the only way I know how is to kill myself. If they reach for a pill, they likely live. If they reach for a firearm, they likely die. And the recidivism rate is next to 0. That cry for pain, that cry in pain, that cry for help by a person who attempts suicide and survives, he or she gets the services, the interventions, the treatment, the care, and the love they deserve. Sorry, there was a gnat. And they don't go on to attempt suicide again. They don't go on to die. So think about it. If we can temporarily separate a person at risk of self-harm from his or her firearm, they'll live. And again, it's about saving lives. It's about understanding where the risk is. It's been a long, 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 hard journey for my family and for many in the gun violence prevention movement. We fight a gun lobby, frankly, that while they say they care about your rights, all they care about is money. They just want to make more money. They just want to make more money. They want to buy more suits. They want to travel by airplane. They want to have 10 houses. They want to everything. I work for a nonprofit, trust me. I don't make a lot of money. And I think saving lives is much more important and much more valuable and much more moral than making money. And if the current definition of the Second Amendment is any gun for any person anywhere, I don't think that's what our founders intended at all. They used the words well-regulated in the Second Amendment. Again, we have great support for these regulations in the Commonwealth. We don't have it everywhere else, and we want to get it. You know, people on the other side will cry, what about Chicago? What about Chicago? Illinois has strong gun laws. The majority of the guns found at crime scenes in Chicago come from out of state. All the states surrounding them that have weak gun laws, like Indiana and Michigan and other places. Heck, the #1 source of crime guns in New York, us, Virginia, we're the #1 source of crime guns in New York, and we're up in the top 5 in many other states. We know we can do better. We know what it's going to take to do better. And I'm committed to sticking with it, at least for a few more years, and trying to make the Commonwealth a safer place for you, your family, your children, and your grandchildren. My granddaughter May is 5 and just started kindergarten. My grandson Jack is 2. Their parents grew up with active shooter drills in their schools, and their mother was shot and injured at college in French class on a Monday morning. I don't want my grandchildren growing up with active shooter drills. I don't want them to know an America that allows too many people too much access to firearms. We can regulate the access, we can respect the Second Amendment, and still look at who's at risk of committing violence and regulate firearms in those situations. I know we can do it. Other countries have done it. Australia had 4 mass shootings between, I think it was 1987 and 1996. After those incidents, public outrage and opinion turned, and they demanded that their parliament pass stricter gun laws. Australia hadn't had a mass shooting since. We can do this. We can get this done. And I think all of our communities deserve to be safe from gun violence. I'm sure I've forgotten something, but those are my remarks for this morning. I'm here for as long as you'd like me to stick around. I'd love to take questions. I'd love to take suggestions. I'd love to take comments. You know, we're getting ready to head into the Virginia General Assembly for 2021. I'm talking to legislators, delegates, and senators. I work with everyone on every side of the aisle. And I would love to know what your thoughts. I would love to hear your suggestions, and I would love to hear your comments and questions. So I'm not sure how to go about it, but I guess Barbara's going to take the microphone around.
Let's start with, would you comment on the influence of the NRA?
Yes. So, you know, in my opinion, the NRA's influence is overrated. They spent quite a bit of money in 2016 getting Donald Trump elected. But I think that was an aberration. In the Commonwealth, they spend very little, frankly. And there are people who don't want to overinflate their influence. Tim Kaine is one. Whether you're a fan or not, he says, oh, the NRA, paper tiger, next question. Whether it's an audience of 5, an audience of 500, or an audience of 5,000, he says they're a paper tiger. You know, and think about it. There are 100 million gun owners in America. My husband's one of them. He has his grandfather's hunting rifle. It's the reason the NRA wants to sell more. Guns are durable goods. My husband can still hunt with his grandfather's hunting rifle. He doesn't need a new one. He's not going to listen to all the reasons he has to fearmonger by the gun lobby to buy more. They're durable goods. They don't, if you take care of them, clean them properly, oil them properly, maintain them properly, store them properly, you know, they can last lifetimes. It's why the gun lobby tries to tell you need to buy more. But in Virginia, we haven't elected an NRA candidate statewide since 2009. And because of gerrymandering, we had far too many, frankly, you know, gun lobby loyalists in office that were there based on the district lines, not based on the voters and their demands. So we'd like, they're under quite a bit of investigation by the New York State's attorney, the USA attorney in DC, a number of organizations. I work for a nonprofit. I see 990s. I see their 990s. The way they take money in, either through their foundation or through their advocacy organization, commingle the funds, spend it on literally hundreds of thousands of dollars for trips and cars and wardrobes on their executive director is flagrantly in violation of the nonprofit laws. You know, my boss will pay for my travel. I have to prove why I was hungry to get my lunch paid for. You know what I mean? He will not pay for alcoholic drinks. He will not pay for any extras. We're a nonprofit. We have a fiduciary obligation to those who donate to us to use their funds wisely and for the express purpose, you know, of educating people about gun violence prevention. I think the NRA particularly is a big fat hoax. They want your money and that's it.
Gun shows. Now in Virginia, are background checks done at gun shows where they weren't prior to this? Is that correct?
Yes, sir, you're correct. So if you're purchasing or buying a firearm from a seller, regardless of whether the seller is a licensed dealer or not, that transaction must undergo a background check.
That's new.
That's new, went into effect on July 1. Sadly, there's a caveat. There was a Democratic senator named Chap Peterson from Fairfax, Virginia, who put an exemption in the bill that I could gift my firearm to you, and that doesn't, gifts are not covered by the background check. Now, there's some legitimacy to that. We understand that. We had exceptions in the background check bill that would exempt gifts to immediate family, inheritance. Some people have a very expensive, very revered gun collection they might want to pass down to their son or grandson or granddaughter. We had exceptions when hunting. We had exceptions when someone's life was in danger. You could, in fact, grab that firearm and help them. We had a number of exceptions. Gifts are not one of them. We suspect that traffickers are now going to say, when the cop goes to the crime scene and finds the gun, oh, it was a gift. It was a gift. It's a loophole that needs to be filled, and we'll have to figure out a way to do that. But if you have any friends in Fairfax, tell them to complain to Chap Peterson about the gift exemption. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Ms. House, for what you're doing. I think it's wonderful that you've taken a family tragedy, really an institutional tragedy, and turned it into something that's positive. What do you, if you had everything you wanted to prevent gun violence, what would be your next steps? Because as you say, what I like about you too is your husband owns a gun, his grandfather's gun. I have a .22 rifle my father got when he was 10 years old, 12 years old in 1910, and it still worked very well, like you say, durable. What would you do? What could you do in the future to make it perfect?
You know, I think, again, it's regulating firearms. Think about it. Many years ago, Congress determined and learned that fully automatic machine guns had no place on our streets. We outlawed the manufacture and the sale of those. However, the ones that were still owned you can still own them. They're collectors. They can transfer those. When was the last time anybody heard about a mass shooting with a machine gun? Not in my lifetime. You know why? They're highly regulated. To transfer one of those, they're collector's items, and many don't work, but many do work if you're, a gun collector and you take care of them. It's because they have to go through an ATF process with a heightened background check, with fingerprints, with a tax, with a lot of regulations wrapped around that transfer. But guess what? You can still transfer them. We need regulations. We regulate teddy bears more in this country. We regulate, squirt guns more than we regulate firearms. Firearms are exempt under certain consumer rules, the Consumer Protection Agency. Firearms are exempt. They're deadly. Why are they exempt? The same with the liability. Did you know that the gun lobby, gun manufacturers, and gun sellers are exempt from lawsuits? Is there any other industry that is exempt from bad actions and bad manufacturing and unsafe practices? No. So at the federal level, I would repeal PLCAGs, the something in Lawful Commerce Act, PLCCA. I would repeal that. And again, I would also, we have technology available. It's called microstamping. That law passed in California 12 years ago. It's taken us that long to get it through the court systems in California. But what it does is leaves an imprint on the casing and on the shell and on the bullet. It leaves this, when the pin hits, it leaves this imprint. Again, when law enforcement go into a crime scene, they're going to automatically be able to trace that firearm. It took 12 years. The gun lobby doesn't want you to be able to trace those firearms. They want to sell more. Same with smart guns. There was a seller, a gun license, a federal firearms license dealer in Maryland. He stocked a smart gun. Smart guns are those that cannot be used by someone else unless some of them are attached to some sort of key fob or pin. Some of them are somewhat attached to your fingerprint or some other biometric. And these smart guns can only be used by the owner. They're set up and they're detailed. And guess what? If you lose one of those, no one else can use it. But the gun lobby went after this seller in Maryland to the point that they blackballed him. They were threatening his kids and dogs and wife and family. And this poor man, this seller, and a federally licensed dealer, just a, I don't know, Joey's gun shop, just took on the wrath of the gun lobby. It was unconscionable. So I think some smart technology is necessary. I think it could help in a lot of situations. And I think we just need more regulations. To get a puppy at the pound, I have to go through a background check. We don't have universal background checks at the federal level. We now have background checks on all purchases in Virginia, but we need them at the federal level. So there's a lot we need to do at the federal level. And lastly, we need to spend more money on violence interruption programs in communities that are disproportionately affected by gun violence. Shootings happen all too often in Richmond, Petersburg, Danville, Roanoke, Chesapeake, Portsmouth, Newport News, and Norfolk. They're some of the highest ones that see shootings on a daily basis. And we want to prevent the shootings also, not just the homicides. You know, if a person has used a firearm with no homicide, guess what? Next step is using it lethally. Other questions, comments, suggestions? I'd really love to hear your suggestions for 2021, the legislative session.
Are you familiar with a program? You talked about community-based programs. Are you familiar with a program called Group Violence Intervention?
Yes, I am.
I belong to an organization called RISK.
Yes, ma'am.
Richmonders involved to strengthen the community, and they are, this is a coalition of churches in the area. They are pushing that.
There are
however, Mayor Stoney not very
Yeah.
interested, so.
The group violence intervention is a very effective model in the states where it's used. But one of the differences, in the states where it's used and most successful, they have many, many gun laws much stronger than even Virginia. So you have to think about where that model is working, if that makes sense. It is one of the models that work. There's also Cure Violence. There's also Ceasefire. And frankly, what we have found the most success with is what is called a hybrid, where you go in and get the very best out of GVI. You go get the very best out of Ceasefire. You go get the very best out of Cure Violence. You look at your population and where the risks are based, and get community buy-in. Some of the GVI models rely too heavily on law enforcement, in my opinion. Not that they're not committed, but at this point in time, we need some trust. We need to find ways to build more trust in communities. There are many communities in downtown Richmond that don't trust law enforcement right now. So I'm all in. I love the work that RISK is doing. Thank you for being part of that. They provide a great service to the community. And I'd love to hear more, and we can talk perhaps after this. But it's a valuable tool. It really is. Again, I just think that communities need to kind of look at all the data, look at all the resources on these interventions, and create a model that perhaps is a hybrid of what would work best in their location. I thought I saw another hand. Yes, sir. Did you have a comment? Here's.
It is the anniversary of Columbine High School, October 20th.
No, sir. It happened in April of 1999.
April 99.
This month, sadly, has the Las Vegas shooting, which is the largest mass shooting in the history of the United States, happened on October 1. And then in Pittsburgh, the temple, the Jewish community there, that shooting was either the 27th, 28th, 29th, right at the end of October. So October is sadly infamous for those two mass shootings that bookend the month. The Las Vegas shooting at the beginning and the Pittsburgh.
All right, getting to Virginia Tech. Only way I read it or I saw it on news, they thought somebody in a hoodie was locking the doors with chains before the shooting took place. But they never, they just let it go or something like that.
I think they did the investigations, and the presumption was because the shooter had visited that building numerous times and had scouted the entrances and the exits and the floors, he had been seen walking up and down the hall on the second floor where he eventually perpetrated the mass shooting. So he had planned this, and there's every expectation and investigation that points that he was the one that chained those doors.
Yeah.
He could have been wearing a hood at the time and chained them, but they think he acted alone.
The thing gets me though, you read in the paper where these people commit a murder and they claim, they were insane at the time when they shot somebody. So then they have to go to the central state or wherever it is and judge.
Yeah, that's a legal process when a person claims insanity, and I think there's some very good restrictions surrounding that and a very good understanding of when it's applicable and when it's not. I'm not a mental health expert, but I've not bumped into any instances where a person seems to have been able to actually take advantage of that diagnosis, but I could be wrong. You know, we always have there's always an exception. Do you know what I mean? Our world isn't perfect. We can have all the gun laws in the Commonwealth, and we're still going to have people who have malice in their heart. We didn't get to them. We didn't prohibit them from access to a firearm. But we can do better. When you have over almost 1,000 gun deaths annually in the Commonwealth, think about that. That's almost 3 a day. Someone's loved one is not coming home today. Perhaps 3 of them.
I'd like to ask a question, the logic of only 1 pistol per month. That's only 12 a year. There's no logic to that at all.
I agree with you.
It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it can be limited to some degree, but that's no limitation at all.
And again, the resistance to it, per me, is the gun lobby that just wants to sell more. They are really trying to find it. You know, there's a pink, this big replica of an AK-47 that they're marketing to children. Again, you go online, you can find them. They're easy to find. It's just absurd in my mind. And again, I'm not this crazy take away all your guns, ban all, you know. My husband takes my son's target shooting. I'll tell you a funny story. So at the Virginia General Assembly, we used to have this meeting on Fridays. It would end about 12:30. I would always lose. The other gun lobbyists would always win. And I saw 3 or 4 of these gentlemen who were lobbyists for the gun lobby standing there, and I just couldn't help myself. And I walked up to him. I said, "Hi, gentlemen. Hope you have a nice weekend." They said, "You too." And I said, "Well, I'm off to go target shooting with my husband and sons." I mean, they just couldn't hardly stand when they heard me say that, and their jaws were on the floor. And I just said, "I'll let you know how I do when I see you on Monday." You know, I think, you know, I personally don't own firearms. I have terrible eye-hand coordination. You know, I could hardly throw you a ball because I just don't have it. So it's not a sport or a hobby that I personally enjoy, but I've gone with my sons and friends and my husband, and my husband grew up hunting. He doesn't do much of it anymore. We have, you know, raising 3 kids and living in Richmond is, you know, doesn't afford you much opportunity, but he's gone hunting with my son-in-law on occasion. It's, you know, sport and hobby is one thing, but, you know, this overarching notion, you know, that one of the gun lobbyists said there shouldn't be any laws. You should be able to get any gun, anytime, and carry it anywhere. There should be no gun regulations. And I just disagree with that. When you have a public health epidemic like we have, the second leading cause of death for children, who are we? When our elected officials pander to a gun lobby that just wants to make more money.
Lord, we are very impressed with your presentation today, your personal story, your commitment, your passion, and we wish you all the well. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And I'll stick around for a few minutes and put my mask on if anybody has a personal question. Is this for me?